Well, let me get into the Word. I have the privilege this morning of continuing a sermon series that we've been in for the last several weeks, a series we've been simply calling Lessons from the Life of Esther. This is now week 4 in this Old Testament book of Esther, and we've talked week after week about what makes this book unique and what makes this book of the Bible stand out from other books of the Bible. This is the only book in the Bible that doesn't explicitly mention the name of God. There are no visions from God, no explicit direction from God as to how his people can avoid disaster, no covert miracles. And so God seems kind of absent. But despite this, we've been trying to zero into the fact that the mega theme of the book of Esther is the providence of God. And the more this story unfolds, especially the episode we'll look at today, we see the hidden hand of God. And the hope of this series is that as we work through this story and highlight the providence of God and the hidden hand of God, that it might spark new imagination in your life for how the hand of God might be at work even in ways that you can't see it. And so since I won't assume that everybody's been following along with us, I just want to recap briefly. The story opens in chapter 1 with the shameful excesses of King Xerxes. You remember the 187-day party he threw for himself, and at the end of that party, he gets drunk and calls for his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and put on a show for his friends. Of course, Queen Vashti refuses, and she is banished from the kingdom, presumably executed. And the king and his advisors engage an idea of having this beauty pageant, which would span all of his 127 provinces. And this beauty pageant was supposed to find a replacement for Queen Vashti. And so all these young, beautiful virgins from all over the kingdom moved toward King Xerxes for this beauty pageant so he could replace the queen. Well, among them is a young Jewish girl named Esther. And she's beautiful and she's smart, and she quickly wins both the contest and the king's affection, and she is crowned the new queen. Esther, we've learned, is the niece and adopted daughter of a Jewish man named Mordecai, and Mordecai had instructed Esther to conceal her Jewish identity so that she could blend in this place where they had settled. And last week, we were introduced to the villain of this story, an insecure little man named Haman. And Haman has been given a place of honor in the kingdom, and the king has decreed that anybody who encounters Haman must bow down when they see him. Well, Mordecai refuses to do so, and so when Haman comes into the presence of Mordecai doesn't bow, and of course this insecure man has a problem with that. And so Haman hatches this plan to punish Mordecai for this open defiance. And he doesn't just come after Mordecai, but as we learned last week, he gets permission from the king to kill all the Jews in all the provinces, and this is a really big deal. And so it was decreed and ordered to destroy, kill, and annihilate Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day. Not only would these people get to kill these Jews, but they would also get to plunder their goods or take their stuff. And so a copy of this text was sent as law to every province, to every nationality, so people could get ready for this day. What a mess, right? More foolish excesses from this terrible regime. And so we've talked so far about lessons about excess, compromise, and Shannon did a fantastic job last week talking to us about the problem of unchecked behavior. And today we'll pick up this story in chapter 4, and today we'll discuss our fourth lesson in this story, and that is a lesson that centers on the subject of crisis. A little word called crisis. Anybody ever experienced a crisis? Have you ever caused a crisis? Has somebody else's reckless behavior caused a crisis in your life? Some of you might say, Pastor, I'm in a crisis right now. A crisis is simply a time of difficulty, a time of trouble, or a time of intense danger. And I got to tell you, maybe it's no surprise to you that I don't look forward to crises. I'm a simple man. I prefer a predictable life, smooth seas, no drama, no issues. I try to avoid crises, right? But what's also true is that I've lived long enough to know that a lot of good can come out of crises, right? We don't want them, We wish they stay as far away from us as possible, but a lot of good can come out of crisis. In fact, if you are honest with yourself and others, you might say that you've come to be who you are today because of a crisis or two that have visited you. That you saw what you were made of in crisis. You recreated yourself. Or you became wiser and stronger and better in a crisis. A lot of good can come out of crisis. I love this quote. I forget who to attribute it to, but I heard years ago that crisis is a good editor, right? Crisis is a good editor. Because in life, you can go along, particularly if your life is going well, if you're sailing on smooth seas, you can go along being distracted. You can go along being rocked to sleep by the tranquil seas, right? And then all of a sudden, crisis hits. And the distractions goes out of the window, because in a moment when those crises hit, you have to draw real quickly into sharper focus what's really important, what's really matters. And you have to engage your higher faculties in the midst of a crisis so that you might come to a positive outcome. Crisis is a good editor because it helps you sort through all the distractions and all the noise and get quickly down to what is important. Crisis is a great editor. Crisis pushes us to solve the problem. There's also a Chinese proverb that says, crisis is an opportunity riding in on dangerous winds. I've come to see crisis also as opportunities. Because while crisis is a time of danger, a time of trouble, a time of difficulty, it can be a defining season for many reasons and in many ways. We don't have too far in our rearview mirror the year 2020, right? Which saw crises stacked on top of crises, right? We had a little pandemic around that time that shut everything down. We had a political year, election that year, and there was a racial crisis that disrupted the nation. And all of those crises stacked on top of each other causes us to edit real fast and figure out who we were and what's important. There were inventions and things that flowed out of those crises that we wouldn't have were it not for those hard times. And those of you who are watching us by live stream, you wouldn't be watching us by live stream were it not for the COVID-19 crisis that shut us down. And so a lot of stuff came out of those really bad times. Great leaders emerge in crisis. Bad leaders are exposed in crisis. Innovation, inventions spring up. And today's lesson from the story in Esther centers on crisis. Today we'll explore how God's people respond to their crises and how we might learn to see opportunity in these moments of difficulty and danger. If you need a title for this message this morning, I'm simply calling it Crisis Equals Opportunity. Crisis equals opportunity. Meet me this morning in your Bibles in Esther chapter 4. That's where we'll pick up the story. And Bibles on the edges of your rows. Feel free to use those Bibles to follow along. You can also follow along on the screens. Let me pray for us while you find that. Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity to come before you and your people and to bring your word. Father, we know in a room this size and those watching us online, there's somebody here today that is in the midst of something that's bigger than them. There's somebody that's in the midst of something chaotic, something scary, something dangerous, something intimidating. And Lord, I pray that you would teach us to see with eyes of faith what opportunities lie in these crisis moments. Lord, there's all kinds of unrest, rage all over the world, in the Middle East, Ukraine, disruptions on college campuses all over. Lord, we know that you are the only solution to all of this craziness. And while there are plenty of things that distract us this morning, would you focus our gaze on you this morning? When we sit at your table and feast on whatever you said there, come Holy Spirit, put power on these messages, these words you've given me. Move the preacher out of the way so that your truth and your light might shine through. We ask all these things in the strong name of Jesus, and all God's people said, amen. Esther chapter 4, I'll start at verse 1. It says, when Mordecai learned about all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap and ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, wept, and wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. Verse 4, when Queen Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of the Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king and beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. And then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message. They're going to go back and forth a couple times. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, for 3 days, night or day. My maid and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. This is the word of the Lord. If you're like me, you think that this story is getting more interesting by the day. These details unfold, right? And so we find out that God's people are in the midst of a crisis. And I want you to notice how they react and respond and what discoveries they make along the way. I also want you to notice how you would typically respond in crisis, how you react initially and how you respond and what discoveries you make as you maybe try to find yourself in this story, because I think there's some helpful lessons for us in this particular episode of Esther's story. There are a few things that I want to zero in on. And the first is I want to notice their initial reactions. Their initial reactions. It's very telling, isn't it, what we do like right when crisis hits, when you first get the news, when you first make the discovery. It's very telling what happens. And as we examine their initial reactions, I think some things hop off the page. Mordecai learns of this plan to annihilate the Jews, and the scriptures tell us that he tore his clothes. He put on burlap and ashes, or sackcloth and ashes, and the text tells us that he began crying with a loud and bitter wail. And this isn't just Mordecai's response. This is what the other Jews in the other provinces, as they learned what would happen, there was great mourning, the text says, among the Jews. They fasted, wept, wailed, and many people lay in burlap and ashes. This ceremonial wailing and grief sweeps over the people as they first hear this news. Now, at first glance, this seems extreme, right? It seems really interesting. But let me be the first to say that this initial reaction to this terrible news is totally appropriate. They've just received devastating news. News that all of their non-Jewish neighbors have been given legal permission to kill them, and to incentivize their participation, they also get to plunder their goods and take their stuff as well. Imagine your neighbor having their eye on your TV or your new car or something like that, and all of a sudden being given license to take you out so they can also grab it. This is terrible. What's more is that the date for this demonstration was set almost a year out. And so imagine they would have a whole year to agonize over this and to stress out over this. And no doubt they begin to think about how this year would complicate their relationship with their neighbors in this mixed community. This is a mess. And I want to say out loud that an appropriate response to crisis, particularly a crisis of this magnitude, is mourning. And I want to take some time to camp out here because maybe no one has ever told you before that it's okay to grieve, okay to be sad, okay to mourn. Maybe you've never heard a preacher say that mourning is a good thing, that it's a healthy thing, that heaven sanctions it. Maybe you have heard or been socialized to believe the opposite. I grew up in a family, I had 7 sisters, just me and my dad. My dad didn't have a normal childhood. He was raised by the streets, and so he didn't have a normal progression through like childhood. He didn't understand, things like boys crying. And he would regularly say to me, man, stop that crying. The boys don't cry. Suck it up, man. Deal with it. And it took me some years to unlearn how I had been socialized by him. And even today, I can find myself having to snap myself out of giving that same faulty instruction to my 4 sons because that advice was broken. And maybe you've been socialized to believe that you needed to be strong. Suck it up. Deal with it. Don't let them see you sweat. Don't let them see you cry. Man up or woman up. And maybe nobody has ever said, guess what? When horrible situations arrest you out of nowhere, it's okay to be devastated. Maybe nobody's told you that when horrible things and horrible people jump out of the bush and do horrible things to you, it's okay to not be okay. I wonder who needs to hear that this morning. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. These are the words of Jesus. The implication here is if you don't mourn, you can't receive comfort. You don't pause and slow down and grieve that thing, or acknowledge the devastation or the pain or the disruption to the normal fabric of your life. If you don't slow down and grieve that thing, no comfort can come from the Comforter. Now these words are situated in what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. And at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, it starts in Matthew chapter 5 and spans a couple of chapters. It outlines the kind of life, or the kind of people that God blesses, the kind of folks, the kind of disposition that heaven leans towards to bless. And there's an interesting list among the attitudes or the dispositions or the kinds of people that God blesses. It reads this way: blessed are the poor, blessed are those that mourn, blessed are those who are meek and lowly, blessed are those who are persecuted, blessed are those who are insulted, blessed are those who are slandered. You get the picture? There seems to be copious amounts of blessedness and heavenly consideration poured toward people who are not okay. And I'm taking my time with this morning because in a room this size and those watching me online, there's got to be at least a handful of folk this morning who are not okay. Something jumped out of the bush in the last couple of weeks. Something arrested you. Something disturbed your peace. And you came in and you're not okay. This is what Mordecai is dealing with. They've got distressing news and they are in mourning, ceremonially mourning. As a community, they're mourning with sackcloth and ashes and wailing. This must be a distressing scene. In the face of all this morning, I might ask you, how are you doing today? What are you carrying this morning? Some of you guys are going through the proverbial ringer. And I know this is statistically true, but I know some of your stories, and I know some of you are in it like they are in it. You're in a horrible place right now. And I want you to know that it's okay to acknowledge it. That there's nothing virtuous about pretending things are fine when they are not. Mordecai gets this right. It's one of the few things he'll get right, but he gets this right. Mordecai and all the Jews that are living outside of the king's palace get this right. But I also want us to notice Queen Esther's initial reaction, because her initial reaction to all of this is a bit suspect, to say the least. We learn from the text that she doesn't even appear to know what's going on. She's tucked away in the lavish eccentricities of the palace, and she is completely unbothered, largely because she doesn't know what's going on. When she sees or witnesses Mordecai, in this deep state of ceremonial grief, what does she do? She tries to send him new clothes. Don't look so disheveled. Get yourself together, Mordecai. This is a really interesting reaction. You ever had friends like this? Your whole world is crashing down around you. You're obviously distressed and in trouble and in mourning. And what do they try to do? They try to cheer you up. They don't ask you what's going on. They don't try to sit with you in your pain. They say, let's go get a drink, girl, and shake yourself out of this. And you don't feel seen. You don't feel heard. You don't feel known. This is what happens. She's totally insulated from this crisis. Why? Because she's in a bubble. She's concealed her Jewish identity as a Jewish woman. She is passing culturally and racially. And so she's not been touched by this in the way that her other folks have been touched. She didn't even get the news. And when she tries to scooch Mordecai quickly past his grief and mourning, he rejects it. He sends the clothes back. And so finally, as we read through this story, Esther sends her attendant named Hathach to find out what the fuss is about. She finally gets around to asking, well, what really is the issue? And then we see here Mordecai's response. We saw his initial reaction to the crisis, but now we get to see his response to the crisis. The plan, he thinks, will work, right? And so for the sake of time, I won't reread it, but in Esther chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, we see Hathach went to Mordecai, asked on behalf of Queen Esther, hey, what's the problem? Why are you in your feelings right now? And Mordecai tells him the whole story. He even gives him a copy of the edict to take back to Queen Esther. And get this, he directs her to go to the king and beg for mercy and plead for the deliverance of what he now calls her people. You see this? Before we wanted to conceal the identity, just sort of blend in, but now he's using his authority and his influence in her life to go and tell her to help out her people. Now, before we unpack this, notice what we've seen and heard. Mordecai's in a desperate situation, appeals to Esther, but I also want you to notice what we still don't see and hear yet. There's still no prayers offered to God. There's still no appeal for God to help, no real thought or expectation that God will intervene. Now, this is super important because if we're honest this morning, this is super familiar to us. That our initial responses and reactions oftentimes don't include God. Now, I know for some of us, we're super saved and our initial reactions and responses always include God, but just for us regular folks, especially if we're experiencing any type of drift from our identity of faith, from communion and fellowship with the living God, we've neglected our devotions. We've neglected the reading of the word. We've neglected fellowship together in communities like this. And so we've drifted. It's often the case that when crisis hits, our initial reactions and responses don't even ponder that God might be the solution. His initial wave of desperation does not seem to consider God at all. And he frames his request curiously. Go to the king, Esther, and beg for help for your people. He's instructed her to conceal her Jewish heritage. Problematic in a dozen different ways. No doubt it's caused her to drift further from her identity of faith, her connection to God. But in these desperate times, in this crisis moment, he wants her to out herself and beg for mercy for her and her people. Now, this is how Esther responds to this, verse 11. She says, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. And she said, on top of this, the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. Now, some of you are confused by this because you've got your Western, 21st century lenses on. You can't imagine how this woman who is the queen, the wife of this king, hasn't seen this cat for 30 days. But things are a little different with King Xerxes. He got a lot of wives. And he's got like a bunch of concubines. And maybe even a few chicks on the side of all of that. And so he might just have a calendar like, hey, these are the ladies that I'm going to entertain. And he hadn't got around to talking to his wife for some 30 days now. And so when Esther gets Mordecai's plan, she goes, man, are you in the dark about this? That is not how this works. She says, I haven't even seen this joker for 30 days. He hasn't called to me. And I don't demand an audience with the king. He has to call for me. And should I take it upon myself to go unto the king, if I were to even say yes to this, I take my life in my own hands. I do it at great risk. This is not at all how this works. Now, she's got the information about what's going to happen to her people. She's not moved to respond at all or risk anything in order to help. This is not a good look for Esther. And some of you had this glowing picture of Esther before we started taking the scenic route through her story. This is not a good look. The people are about to be wiped out. She's cozy in the palace, seemingly resistant to the idea of helping out. This is where we are in the story. But something shifts at this crucial point in this crisis moment that is worth noting. Esther pushes back on Mordecai's plan, and things in his mind get more desperate. And we are now at the height of the crisis, because not only has Mordecai got this bad news, but the plan that immediately came to him has been rejected by what seems like the only person who could do something about it. And I want you to take note of what happens at this particular moment in this particular crisis. My last point this morning is that a dual opportunity is uncovered. I told you, crisis often gives way to opportunity. Crisis equals opportunity. And at this moment, based on Esther's reply to Mordecai, a dual opportunity is uncovered. Esther basically says, bro, I can't help you. I can't get involved. It's too risky. And so Mordecai sends Hathach back. And maybe Hathach's like, maybe can we arrange a meeting with you guys so I'm not going back and forth? But he sends back another message, verse 13. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. Verse 14, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows, he continues, if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. Now, don't fall asleep at this point, because this is really like the most important verse in all of Esther. Typically, if somebody is quoting Esther, they are quoting from this passage right here, because these are the money verses. Now, you got to get your magnifying glass out, because what we will see here will need to be seen through the lines. We see a consciousness about God's involvement begin to rise up in Mordecai's thinking. Mordecai seems to have snapped into a realm of thinking that we haven't seen from him nor Esther up until this point. There is a shift in how he's talking, how he's reasoning, and even how he's discipling and advising his adopted daughter, Esther. It's subtle. If you blink, you'll miss it, but I won't let you blink, and I won't let you miss it, right? And this shift is a product of the worsening crisis he finds himself in at the moment. Because this crisis and this desperation is yielding for him what crisis and desperation often does: clarity, right? I told you how crisis hits, and all of a sudden things are drawn into sharper focus. The things that don't matter fall off. And so clarity is the fruit of this crisis, especially as he wades into it. And first, he gives her a bit of a practical advice. Esther, don't think it's sweet. Don't think for a moment that because you're in this palace, that you will escape when all of your countrymen are dying. Like, there are people out there who know you're a Jewess. And if it came down to it, somebody's probably going to sing like a bird. Don't think you'll say. She said, I can't get involved. He said, you must. Don't forget, you're a Jew. The palace has rocked her to sleep. She's gotten complacent and comfortable and cozy, and she's needed a reminder. And I imagine that Mordecai is maybe speaking with a little bit of an elevated tone. He's using his parent voice to bring her into a better understanding. Not just that, there is a curious mention of deliverance. That's like God language. That's spiritual talk. He says, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die again. We're reading between the lines here, but this is a different kind of talk. And so he seems to see an opportunity. An opportunity for what? An opportunity for God to show up. An opportunity for God to be in the midst. Mordecai seems to have tapped into something that we haven't seen from him before, heard from him before, and that is this thought that deliverance and relief from the Jews might be the work of God. Doesn't mention God, but his communication is, shall we say, God-ish. Sounds like somebody is starting to suddenly remember some things. This crisis-induced clarity is jogging his memory, and he's starting to maybe remember some things that are connected to his heritage as a follower of Yahweh. Maybe he starts to remember that old Sarah was 90 when God showed up as a promise keeper and gave her a son. Maybe he's starting to remember that Sarah's son Isaac was on the altar and Abraham's hand with the knife was coming down in threat of forfeiting the promise that Israel will be a great nation and that the descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And then he remembers that it was God, it was Yahweh who put an animal in the thickets so that the promise might come to be. And maybe he's starting to remember that Abraham's descendants had become a nation and Pharaoh's army was about to destroy God's people as they fled from Egypt. And God opened the sea to let his people go free and closed the sea behind them when the pursuing army came after him. He's starting to remember what his distance from God and his distance from God's people has caused him to forget. He remembers that God is working and he is a keeper of his people and his promises. This is an opportunity for God to show up, and not for God to show up, but maybe he's starting to sense that God is already in it. And I wonder if for those of you who are in crisis moments right now, particularly if your crisis is as a result of your drift from God and the things of God, if you can begin to have imagination for the ways that the hidden hand of God might be working. that this crisis is an opportunity, not just so God can show up, but so that God can be made known to you for the ways that he's already involved in the situation. This crisis gives way for an opportunity to God's hand to be seen. There is talk of deliverance. But there's another opportunity. I told you this was a dual opportunity. It seems that Mordecai is beginning to see, and therefore wants Esther to see, that this is not just an opportunity for God to show up, but this is an opportunity for Esther to show up. This is an opportunity for God's human creation to partner with him to great risk, but also to partner with him for the solution that he wants to bring about in the earth. Mordecai says, little girl, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? This communication is now dripping with the consciousness of God's hidden hand pulling the strings behind the scenes. And it's such a mystery, which is why we tend to want to reject the providence and the workings of God, because if we don't see it, it ain't there. If we can't put our hands on it and explain it in our human language, it didn't happen, or it's not going to happen. But we've got all sorts of history with God, that he's in the mix and he's working things out. You say, well, was it God's plan to do this all along? Or did the circumstances of our life and people's decisions, did he sort of manipulate those things and work them together for good? Yes. It's mysterious. It's wholly divine. But somehow, some way, Mordecai puts it together, and he said, it can't be a coincidence that at this particular time in our history, you are situated like just few doors down from the king. You have the ear of the king. You've concealed yourself in a shameful way, but that's allowed you to be in this moment. Maybe God has you as queen for this particular time. Ooh, this should arrest you. Because some of us have just been building a life for ourselves, and all we've been doing in pursuing career is pursuing comfort and feathering our own nest. And some of us, perhaps most of us, if not all of us, are currently situated in key places in our cities. Key places on boards of directors, at jobs, in schools, on police departments. You're sitting in an engineering firm. You're in a part of a homeschooling group. You're at universities or colleges or sports teams. You go to a gym, and maybe God has you there as an inside man or woman, because when a crisis hits in that place or in somebody's life that's connected to that, maybe you're the person that he's going to call off the bench in order to bring some deliverance. But how many of you know, if your life is about you, if your objective in life is to be comfortable, is to be cozy, is to avoid risk, if your disposition, I can't mess up a good thing, you'll never speak up when you see injustice. Never. And your initial reaction is to run from the trouble, and to run from the chaos and the crisis. Years ago, I heard an old proverb. They say, you can tell who the elders are in the village when there's a fire in the village. When you see the smoke billowing from over the trees, watch who's running from the smoke, and watch those who run toward the smoke. Those who are running toward the smoke are the elders. I wonder if you're running toward the smoke in the places where you are. If you've considered the fact that God has planted you in a place, in a company, in a family, in a neighborhood, on a street, for such a time as this. You know, if you get out of bed in the morning and your thought is, I just want to get back to this bed later, as few interruptions as possible. You know, that's not a stupid idea. It's just not a Christian one. If you get out of the bed and say, Lord, make me an answer to a problem today. God, make me interruptible. Give me the eyes of heaven so that I might see where the smoke might be billowing out over the trees. That I may be distinguished as one of yours because I'm running toward the smoke rather than away from it. Make me an instrument. Make me an answer. Something shifts as Mordecai begins to see. And as he begins to see, he begins to use his influence as Esther's parent, not to have her conceal her identity or to run away from the trouble, but he's causing her now to press toward it. You see the difference the shift makes? You see how dangerous it is to forget God and to drift and to conceal who he is and what he means to you? But you see the immediate shift that happens once you start to be God conscious again and aware that the hidden hand of God is working in ways that you may not be able to perceive. Worship team, you can come up as I land the plane. I'm over my time. As we put this together, we notice Esther's reply and the shift that happens in her heart. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews, my people, of Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. And listen to this. If I must die, I must die. I mean, just a few verses ago, she was telling all the reasons why she couldn't go, why it was dangerous. And in an instant, Mordecai snapped out of it. Now she snapped out of it, and her disposition now is I want all the smoke, all of it. And if I must die, I must die. I wonder if we have this disposition, especially when crises have manifested themselves around us. Crises that maybe we've caused. Crisis maybe that other people's bad decisions have called for us. I wonder if we have eyes to see, a heart to perceive the hidden hand of God and how he might be using this disruption for his greater glory and for our good. For his greater glory and for the common good of the other humans. I wonder how many of us have been rocked to sleep, have been rocked toward indifference by our pursuit of comfort, our participation in that comfort, and our distance from God. There's a couple of waves of people that I feel like we need to minister to today. There are folks who are you're just in a crisis right now. Life is just crashing down on you, and the best phrase I can come up is, you're in a horrible place. You're in a horrible place. I mean, your situation is impossible. I think the Lord wants to bring comfort for you today. And there are others who've gotten real comfortable, like Esther. And you would say that your aim in life is to be as comfortable as possible, to feather your nest so it's just cozy. And your attention has not been to be available to God in the way that he needs you to be available. And even now, the Spirit is bringing to your remembrance things that you've turned a blind eye to, situations where you could have rendered help and aid, but you didn't because it would have disrupted your good thing. You understand what I'm saying to you? And whether you're a student or whether you're one of our seniors or anybody else in between, the Lord might be calling you to consider how you might be his instrument. Hope and help. That your instincts might be to run toward the smoke and not away from it. I feel like the Lord is calling those of you to do that. And the last thing that I'll mention is I can't help but think of the influence that Mordecai had toward his adopted daughter and how he stewarded that like in a wrong way at first. But as the Lord gripped him, he used that influence to move her to a place of God consciousness. And I think there are some of us here who would be honest and say that you haven't used your God-given influence to disciple and to raise up and to build up kids and students and teenagers and young adults that will run toward God's purpose, even if it costs them something. And the Lord is not in a condemning way, but in a real way, challenging those of us who need to reckon with this today.